Before we begin, let me just say quickly, and this is nothing like a disclaimer. I'm just saying that I don't completely agree with the tenor, the tone that Dr. Coleman takes in addressing some of these issues. I think what's important here is that his research has exposed an agenda that is cynically used, I think, a lot of, at least initially, very laudable goals in terms of feminism and tolerance, but that has usurped, commandeered these agendas and steered them in a direction that is dangerous. And I think that's what we need to take away from this, and maybe put aside what may be kind of an instinctive, where I tend to recoil from a lot of the statements in this chapter specifically. But let's just stay on track in terms of exposing and understanding the adversary and the power, the scope, the deep, dark genius of this oligarchical control mechanism. So let's just leave it there. Chapter 8, Degrading Women and Decline of Moral Standards. The pace of degrading womanhood has quickened at a remarkable degree since hemlines reached the knee. This is manifesting itself in such areas as near pornography and mainstream movies, and soap operas, and we venture to suggest that the day is not far off when such scenes will be total and mandatory. This decline in attractive feminine speech can be traced to Tavistock methodology and its practitioners Cantrell, Lickert, and Lewin. Another noticeable change was the increase in movies featuring interracial dating and sexual encounters coupled with human rights claims for lesbians in the most blatantly open form. Special people were selected and trained for this task, probably the best known of many being Ellen DeGeneres, who received hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free publicity under the guise of being interviewed on talk shows and discussion groups on the subject of same-sex love, meaning encounters between two females involving a type of sex practice. Benton, the pioneer in degrading womanhood, had as his mentor social scientist's leading expert in profiling theory at Tavistock, one Harold Laswell, who, together with Benton, founded the American Policy Commission in 1940. Laswell's joint venture with Benton marked the clearest link between Aspen's hidden socialist one-world government operations in America and the Tavistock Institute. Aspen became the headquarters of the Committee of 300 branches in the United States. Hedley, Cantrell, Lickert, and Lewin, with their humanistic psychology brainwashing applied methodology, played an increasingly vital role in using opinion research to bring about paradigm shifts, value shifts in societies such as those just described, but on an expanded range and reaching into every level of society that comprised Western civilization, as it had been known for centuries. Cantrell's home base, from where he conducted his war operations against the American people, was the Office of Public Opinion Research at Princeton University, founded in 1940, the same year in which Cantrell wrote his book entitled The Invasion from Mars, a detailed analysis about how the population of New York, New Jersey area reacted with fear and panic to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938. How could they have known that they were part of a profiling venture, since it is reasonable to conclude that in 1938 not 1 in 5 million had ever heard of Hadley Cantrell or the Tavistock Institute. It would be interesting to find out how many Americans have heard of Tavistock now in 2005. I would just say very, very few. I'm seeing it in 2021. It's just negligible. Most would remember Orson Welles, but the probabilities are that 99% of the population would not attach any significance to the name Cantrell or have any knowledge of the Tavistock Institute. Let us recount the events of the night of October 30th, 1938, because the same techniques have been used by the Bush administration, the Defense Department, and the CIA to shape the public perception of the events that led up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and are still very much in use in 2005. In 1938, Orson Welles had created quite a reputation for himself as a master at staging faux news events by making use of the English author H.G. Wells, a former MI6 operative, and his book, The War of the Worlds. In the radio adaptation of the Wells work, the other Wells, Orson Welles, interrupted radio programs in New Jersey with an announcement that Martians had just landed. "The Martian invasion has begun," said Orson Welles. During the 4-hour-long production, it was announced no less than 4 times that what radio audiences were listening to was a fictitious reenactment of what it would be like if H.G. Wells' story had come to life. But that availed nothing. Panic gripped millions of Americans who fled from their homes in terror, jamming roads and communication systems. What was the purpose of this hoax? In the first instance, it was to gauge just how effective Cantrell and Tavistock's methods were in practice, and perhaps of greater importance, it was to set the stage for the coming war in Europe, in which news broadcasts would play a crucial role in information gathering and dissemination as an established source of reliable information, as well as a forum for directing public opinion. 2 days after the Martian invasion news broadcast, an editorial in the New York Times headed "Terror by Radio" inadvertently shed light on what Tavistock had in mind for the American people in the coming war now looming closer. "What began as entertainment might readily have ended in disaster," the editorial said. Radio officials had a responsibility and, quote, "should think twice before mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying." What the Times had inadvertently stumbled onto was the wave of the future seen through the eyes of the theoreticians at Tavistock. Henceforth, mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying that it would be taken as fact was to be standard practice for the graduates of Tavistock. All news broadcasts were to be adaptations of news and fiction in a skillful blend so as to make the one unrecognizable from the other. In fact, Tavistock put their newly tested theory into practice a year later when the population of cities in Europe, London, Munich, Paris, and Amsterdam were smitten with war jitters, even as Neville Chamberlain was successfully avoiding the war using the same techniques that were employed in the October 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts. Chapter 9. How individuals and groups react to blending fact with fiction. Cantrell's conclusion was that the public reacted exactly as his profiling research experiments had led him to believe it would. That Sunday night, October 30th, 1938, was to become a landmark date in his files, and a date signifying a vast paradigm shift forever in the way that, quote, news would be henceforth presented. Slightly more than 7 decades later, the world is still being fed a diet of news mingled with fiction that in so many instances is terrifying. The Western world has undergone drastic changes unwillingly forced upon it, that it has become a world so vastly different from what it was on that October night in 1938 as to be another planet. We shall return to this vital subject later in this work. Following the Second World War, Cantrell became totally involved with the head guru at Tavistock, its founder, John Rawlings Rees, and his World Tensions Project at the United Nations UNESCO. Profiles on how individuals and groups reacted to international tensions were formulated on the basis of skillfully blending fact with terrifying fiction in preparation for a campaign to launch world citizens of a one-world government socialist communist dictatorship that began to be employed to weaken national boundaries, language, and culture, and to discredit pride of nations and sovereignty of nation-states in preparation for the coming of the socialist New World Order, one-world government that President Woodrow Wilson said America would make safe for, quote, democracy. Those fresh-faced young American boys from Arkansas and North Carolina were sent marching off to Europe, believing they were, quote, fighting for their country, never knowing that the democracy Wilson sent them to make safe for the world was a socialist, international, communist, one-world government dictatorship. John Rawlings Rees was the publisher of Tavistock's magazine, Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Their joint thinking mentality is seen in the 1955 monograph Toward a Humanistic Psychology, and as a progression of Cantrell's support for the Tavistock-trained Gordon Airport, that's probably a misprint, perception of the personality. I'll sort that out later. As he expressed it in the 1947 book, Understanding Man's Social Behavior, in a chapter on causality, Cantrell's methodology was based on the conception that, quote, the particular environment in which growth takes place gives the particular individual a particular direction for growth. Cantrell's endeavors are good examples of the breakdown of boundaries between supposedly neutral opinion-taking and social engineering opinion-making. Tavistock's commitment to forcing major shifts in personality and behavior in all sectors of targeted population groups such as we have sought to describe. Cantrell appointed a board of directors to assist in the work, among who were Warren Bennis, a follower of Tavistock director Eric Trist, Marilyn Ferguson, allegedly the author of the Aquarian Conspiracy, Jean Houston, head of the Institute for Brain Research, member of the Club of Rome and author of Mind Games, Aldous Huxley, who supervised the MK-Ultra LSD program that ran for 20 years, Willis Harman, a Stanford University director and mentor of The Changing Images of Man, later disguised as The Aquarian Conspiracy, passed off as the work of Marilyn Ferguson. Michael Murphy, head of the Esalen Institute, established by Huxley and others as the Center for, quote, sensitivity training and drug experiments. James F.T. Bugenthal, an initiator of cult creation projects at Esalen. Abraham Maslow, the leading exponent of the irrationalist think force and founder of AHP in 1957. Carl Rogers, Maslow's co-worker at the AHP in 1957. AHP's reigning ideology was exemplified by a book review in a 1966 issue of its journal, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Reviewing Maslow's book, The Psychology of Science, Willis Harman, a year before his 1967-1969 Stanford research study, welcomed the challenge to science from extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, mysticism, and consciousness-expanding drugs, particularly LSD and mescaline. He lauded Maslow's new science, since it would bring to the fore, quote, hypnosis, creativity, parapsychology, and psychedelic experience, and shift scientific concern away from the outside world to studying inner space. This was Cantrell's original particular personality thinking brought to its logical conclusion. To Cantrell goes the glory and honor of forcing a vast paradigm shift on the way the Western world thinks and behaves. Certainly Oswald Spengler would have had no trouble in identifying it as one of the causes of the downfall of the West he had predicted in 1936. Making changes in the cognitive and behavioral structure. Whatever the particular coloration of ideology that accompanied the scientists of the polling institutions after World War II, the invariant notion of social engineering, trough sampling methods, and opinion research could be found in Cartwright's paper, Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, prepared for the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture. The paper was subtitled, quote, Selected Findings of Research on the Sale of the United States War Bonds. But, as Cartwright makes clear, the war-related aspect of the survey was just a pretext for conducting an analysis on the principles of how perception can be modified to suit whatever ends the controller might have in mind. One would be puzzled as to what the sale of war bonds had to do with agriculture, but that was part of Cartwright's methodology. It was the Bernays-Lippmann-Cantrell-Cartwright hypothesis synthesized and concentrated in a World War II setting. The article was featured in Tavistock's journal, Human Relations, which ought to have immediately brought the reader to attention. Among the many technological advances of the past century that have produced changes in social organization, Cartwright began, the development of the mass media of communication promises to be the most far-reaching. This heightened interdependence of people means that the possibilities of mobilizing mass social action have been greatly increased. It is conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will. Let me read that again. It is conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will. Unquote. We do not believe that Cartwright had Jesus Christ in mind when he made that statement. Under a subheading, creating a particular cognitive structure, Cartwright continues, Principle 1. It is considered a truism by virtually all psychologists that a person's behavior is guided by his perception of the world in which he lives. It follows from this formulation that one way to change a person's behavior is to modify his cognitive structure. The modification of cognitive structure in individuals by means of the mass media has several prerequisites. These may be stated in the form of principles, unquote. Interspersing his account with examples from the application of his study to the World War II war bonds sale drive, Cartwright then elaborated the principles. Quote, the message, i.e. information, facts, etc., must reach the sense organs of the persons who are to be influenced. Total stimulus situations are selected or rejected on the basis of an impression of their general characteristics, etc. A second set of principles investigated more deeply the methods of altering cognitive structure. Principle 2. Having reached the sense organs, message must be accepted as part of the person's cognitive structure. Cartwright noted in this section that, quote, any effort to change behavior through a modification of this cognitive structure must overcome the forces tending to maintain the present structure. Only when a given cognitive structure seems to the person to be unsatisfactory for his adjustment is he likely readily to receive influences designed to change that structure. Under creating a particular motivational structure, Cartwright analyzed further, quote, the social inductions, the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in Washington, into turmoil for a protracted period.